Hey guys, welcome to the True Mouse Games YouTube channel and welcome to another episode of Game Master's Musings. In this episode, we will be raising a bit of a controversial topic and many of you will probably disagree with me on most of those issues that I'm talking about today, but maybe you won't, we'll see. Before we launch into my little rant, I would like to say one thing though. Role-playing games are great because they can be played in many thousands, probably maybe even tens of thousands of different ways. So no matter what you like in a role-playing game, if you find the right group, it will be a lot of fun. No matter if it's weird or crappy or bullshit for other people, whether that other people being me or anyone else really, if you find the right group, it will be good. Of course, if you find the wrong group, things are probably going to be a little more complicated. Anyway, I still feel that this topic needs to be talked about, especially when it comes to adventure design and for dungeon masters out there who might be watching this video. Well, me personally, as you probably figured by now, otherwise I wouldn't be talking about role-playing games on YouTube, do absolutely love pen and paper role-playing games. I've been doing it for about 15 years or so, and I've played with many great players and with quite a few good game masters as well. And that said, I still had some sessions that I was really unhappy with, whether it was me running or playing, even with really good game masters, and I do consider myself a fairly decent game master. Those sessions were pretty bad. Why? Well, because of dungeons and because of crawling. The crawling through dungeons, that is. And before we launch into the main topic, let me start with a definition of what I am talking about in this video. So a dungeon, I suppose, in a role-playing game would be really any enclosed area that is hostile towards the player characters. That's not what I'm talking about in this video. I'm talking about the more classical dungeon. You all know what I mean when I say that, right? It's the mostly underground, submerged or something ancient ruin with tons of tunnels and rooms, many different types of monsters, traps and riddles that the players need to overcome. That is what I'm talking about in this video. As you have figured from the title of the video, I personally really don't like dungeons. And I'm going to tell you why in this video. And hopefully this will give you some inspiration, whether you are the game master or a player, to change things up a little bit and maybe realize that even though you might like the experience of a dungeon crawl, other people, including me, but probably, hopefully, also many others, might not share that enthusiasm. Being aware of what other people, no matter whether they be game masters or players at your table, enjoy and don't enjoy, is a very significant part of being a good player, a good game master, and making a role-playing game fun for everyone involved. The first and biggest issue that I probably have with dungeons is that they always felt detached from the rest of the role-playing game to me. They always felt like a mini-game within the actual game. Why is that? Well, it's mostly because they are unrealistic and follow a very weird sort of innate logic of the dungeon, so to speak. A skilled game master, you will notice probably that I very rarely use the term dungeon master, mostly because I don't like dungeons anyway. That's just a little aside. A skilled game master can definitely, if they are aware of the issue, avoid most of the stuff that I'll be talking about in the next couple of minutes in this first point about dungeons, that is. Well, why do I think that dungeons are unrealistic and are a little bit of a minigame? Well, there's a couple points. Firstly, so many monsters living close to each other doesn't make a lot of sense. So the ecology or whatever you want to call it of a dungeon, goblins in this room, and then there's a bunch of orcs, and there's a troll, and there's like a sphinx, and then there's like animated armors, and then one room down there's a beholder and whatnot. This just doesn't make sense. Where do these monsters get their food from? Why don't they fight each other constantly? Why hasn't the strongest type of monster just conquered most of the dungeon? There's a lot of questions that I pose myself when I'm a player, definitely, and a lot of other players also pose themselves. Then there's the random traps. If there's so many monsters living in a dungeon, why the hell are there still traps that haven't been activated? Also, if the monsters themselves place those traps, then it must be pretty crazy. I mean, it's their living area, right? Would you place a trap between your living room and your toilet? The chances that you or your children would kill themselves at that trap is much higher than some random, burglar or something coming in and activating it, right? The whole playstyle that traps enforce upon players is something that I personally really dislike when I'm the game master. This sort of, you know what I mean, right? It's sort of creeping down the corridor. I roll, check for traps. I move 2 more yards, check for traps. Oh, there's a door, check for traps. Oh, there's another hallway, check for traps. It's just this constant rolling, this constantly having these weird artificial breaks that come from the player side because they're so paranoid about traps is something I really dislike in the game. And then there's the riddles. Why the heck would anyone place a riddle in a dungeon? I mean, I could think of basically one reason. The reason is, to have only those enter who prove themselves worthy. Maybe being specifically clever, maybe being specifically strong or brave or something like that, right? That would make sense. Otherwise, you just need a password or a key to pass through, right? And whoever that person is that doesn't have a password or doesn't have a key, they're not supposed to enter anyway, right? So why give them hints to a real, proper solution? That's like, I suppose, having a password, protecting your private files, and then attaching a riddle to that password, and whoever solves the riddle will have access to where you are, your credit card information, and all that sort of stuff. So these riddles often seem very random and very arbitrary to me, and they, again, seem like a minigame within the actual game. Then there's my personal pet peeve in this regard, the monster reaction to intrusion. Imagine someone trying to infiltrate a military complex in our time. First shots are fired, a whole bunch of guards come running from all directions to stop intruders. In a dungeon, usually that sort of stuff doesn't happen, in a classical dungeon anyway. You fight monsters in one room and the monsters in the next room are just like, fighting noises. Oh well, whatever, we're on a coffee break, right? So you have to sort of progress and fight one battle and then the next battle and then the next battle. And sometimes you even sleep in a dungeon, which also doesn't really make much sense. Because if the monsters are wandering around, they would find their dead allies or their missing allies. And they would gang up, bring everyone they can and find the intruders and wipe them out. Dungeons are usually very long. And for the players, they are very hard to imagine. So either you give them a map, which by itself already sort of gets them into a board gamey type of mindset where they're following, looking down from above and following their characters, their figurines around on the map, like with a board game, right? And also because of these illogical issues that I have raised, the player immersion is damaged quite heavily in a lot of ways because they no longer have the feeling that they are in a living, breathing, realistic world, right? The second reason why I hate dungeons and why I think dungeons suck is they are a really pain in the ass to prepare for the game master, or in that case, dungeon master. Firstly, you need to know a lot of rules, you need to prepare a lot of monsters, you need to make traps, you need to come up with riddles, you need to know every little detail. You need to draw a map, which takes a lot of time that, in my opinion, could be spent preparing something else that is much more fun, with far greater efficiency than drawing a map for a dungeon. You need to know all these nitty-gritty details that, in my opinion, don't really add much to the actual game as such. Also, there is this preconception in both the game master's mind and the player's mind is that this is how a dungeon has to be, right? Now we are entering a dungeon, switch off your logic. You are now functioning by dungeon logic. You know there'll be traps, you know there'll be secret doorways, you know there'll be monsters that you fight, and then you move on to the next room and fight a bunch more monsters, and so on and so on. This is the classical dungeon design, right? And we have, for some reason, stick to that. And having that enforced weird dungeon logic that you have to stick to as a game master really kills my personal creativity, and I think a lot of game masters share that intention or that sensation anyway. And then the third reason why I hate dungeons is they are extremely restrictive to the players. This is, for once, because they are often very linear, because you have walls and you can't pass through the walls, right? So you only can go left or right. You can open that door or that door, which means that you have 2, maybe 3 ways, and that's it, right? The possibilities are far smaller, which is, I suppose, why a lot of game masters do like dungeons, because it lets them feel like they're more in control, because the players don't have that many options, and it makes them feel like they can be better prepared, because if you only have 3 options, you can prepare all 3 of those. But outside in the real role-playing world, the players have an infinite amount of options, basically, and you can never prepare every single one. So this speaks to the I wish to control everything type of game master a lot of ways, which that's not a bad thing, by the way, necessarily. I have that game master within myself as well, but I try to not give him the reins too often anyway. Dungeons are not only linear in a geographical sense, only one or this other corridor, they're also linear in a problem-solving sense. Usually the only problem is violence, with maybe a little bit of stealth thrown in there. There's very little NPC interaction unless the player characters enforce it by capturing some monsters and interrogating them or something, which is, by the way, done way too rarely for players, because a monster living in a dungeon would have to know everything, right? So why don't you just knock the first goblin that you find unconscious and ask them about everything? And then you have a lot of information that your dungeon master probably doesn't want you to have anyway. The dungeons are also often repetitive. You enter a room, you check for traps, you go into the next room, you kill a bunch of monsters, you loot them, you go down a corridor, you open the next door, you check for traps, then you enter the corridor, and then you approach the door, then you check for traps again, then you open that door and you fight a bunch more monsters, and you repeat that with a few rests in between until you get to the big boss and get the big loot, which is very board gamey. And as I said at the start, this can be a valid way of playing, it's just not a way that I enjoy. And this mindset of we need to follow the rules of dungeon exploration, constantly checking for traps, checking for secret doorways, fighting monsters room by room by room, and so on, is a mindset that players are forced into as well, just by their simple expectation. And that makes the game repetitive and, in my eyes, boring. Now, what are the solutions to that issue? For me personally, anyway. I can tell you 3. First one is make short dungeons. So if the dungeon's only 2 or 3 rooms, it's not really a dungeon as such. Most people wouldn't perceive it that way anyway. And if you have short dungeons, a lot of the problems that I mentioned before, the repetitiveness, the illogical area, the restrictions that are placed upon player characters, and so on, just disappear. The second way to make dungeons a bit more interesting is to have heavy story tie-ins, like themes, basically. This is a submerged dungeon, ruled by a naga, and there's a whole bunch of different fishmen. But having just one type of monster, it makes it easier to make the dungeon thematic, but it makes it more difficult to make the dungeon interesting fight-wise, because you're always fighting the same monsters 3, 4, 5, 6 times in a row isn't very interesting. But you can mix things up, and especially story tie-in wise, you can have something happening within the dungeon that the player characters know about, and NPCs placed within the dungeon that the player characters also know. So the knowledge that they have and the sort of experience that they have already had with certain inhabitants will serve to connect the dungeon experience, the minigame, to the actual proper campaign, so to speak, the outside world. And in that way, it won't quite feel like such a minigame anymore. And then the third way is you can change conditions in a dungeon. Don't listen to that rule set that says this is how a dungeon has to be. Change it up completely. Maybe you have a dungeon that is shifting around constantly, so the map is impossible to create. Maybe you have a dungeon that is within an actual creature, say a massive earth titan, moving around. All those things, changing sceneries. One room is icy, slippery, the other room is hot with all the torches, environmental conditions, so to speak, darkness and light and temperature and traps, I suppose, would fall into that, can make a dungeon more interesting. Then again, I would still prefer to keep it short, even with those spicing it up things in there. So what do you think? Did I convince you that my point of view has some merit, or do you think I'm full of shit? Let me know either way. And also let me know if you have had any really good experiences or really bad experiences with specific dungeons, especially dungeons that are to be found in sort of pre-published campaigns or adventures, no matter the role-playing game they come from. Let me know also if your game master, or you yourself, if you are a game master, has found a really cool solution to make dungeons more interesting, and generally what you think about the whole topic. As always, if you liked our content, subscribe to our YouTube channel. The link will be appearing right up here. We'll be running more games and talking about far more Game Master stuff. And until we see each other again, good luck with your own games. And True Mask Games says bye-bye and good night. Thanks for watching.